There are certain words that echo through the years, like stray bullets in the desert, ricocheting off the rocks of memory until they find their target in the hearts of those who need to hear them. Billy Macready arrived in Redemption Springs one August morning when the sun was still battling the shadows of dawn. His boots kicked up small clouds of red dust with every step, and the worn hat protected eyes that had already seen too much for his 42 years. He had a particular way of walking, not as someone who's in a hurry, but as someone who learned that arriving alive at the destination is worth more than arriving first. The city woke up slowly. The blacksmith was already striking his gavel in a cadence that echoed between the wooden buildings, and the aroma of strong coffee escaped from Martha Henderson's boarding house. Billy stopped in front of the room, still closed at that early morning hour, and watched the distorted reflection that the dusty glass gave him. He was a man who carried his choices on his face, each line a story, each mark a lesson. It was then that she appeared on the porch of the two-story house across the main street, Renata Silvera. The name came to him through whispered comments in the boarding house, always accompanied by looks of disapproval or barely concealed curiosity. She swept the porch with determined movements, as if she were trying to ward off more than just the accumulated dust of the night. The dark blue dress she wore was simple but well cut, without the ruffles and ornaments that the other women in the city considered essential. Her dark hair was tied up in a loose bun, with a few unruly strands that danced in the morning breeze. There was something about his stance that caught the eye, a quiet dignity that seemed to defy small-town conventions. Billy watched her for a moment that seemed to extend beyond time. She looked up, and their gazes met across the dusty street. It was not one of those meetings of glances from romantic tales. It was something deeper and quieter, a mutual recognition of souls who knew loneliness. She did not look away, as the other women in the city did when a stranger watched them. Instead, he held his gaze with a serenity that spoke of someone who had learned to face the judgment of others without bowing. Billy touched the brim of his hat in a respectful greeting, and she responded with a barely perceptible nod of her head. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of other people on the street. Mrs. Peterson came out of her house with a look of disapproval already formed on her face, as if she had woken up ready to judge. Reverend Collins walked toward the church, his footsteps echoing a solemn rhythm on the wooden floor of the sidewalk. Billy noticed how Renata straightened her shoulders when she saw the neighbors. It was not a gesture of defiance, but of preparation. Like a soldier who stands before battle, she armed herself with her dignity to face another day of whispers and skewed looks. During the next few days, Billy established his routine in the city. He drank coffee at Martha's boarding house, talked to Sheriff Thompson about odd work, and spent afternoons at the salon playing cards with the locals. But his eyes were always looking for Renata's figure on the streets of Redemption Springs. She worked as a seamstress, and Billy knew that her hands created dresses that were more beautiful than anything that arrived by train from the big cities. The women of the city wore their creations with pride, but spoke of it in whispers when they thought no one was listening. It was a contradiction that Billy understood all too well. The house where she lived was on the respectable edge of town, but far enough away that she could maintain her privacy. Billy passed by a few times, always with some plausible excuse, and noticed how she tended to a small garden on the side of the house. The flowers that grew there were hardy like herself, able to bloom even under the relentless western sun. One afternoon, as the shadows were beginning to lengthen and the temperature finally gave a respite, Billy saw her in the fabric store, arguing with the landlady about the price of a few feet of silk. The conversation was tense, and he realized that it wasn't just about business. There was a question of respect that went far beyond the value of the merchandise. Renata walked out of the store with her head held high, but Billy saw something in her eyes that he immediately recognized. It was the fatigue of those who fight every day to keep their dignity intact in a world that insists on judging them by appearances. It was a silent battle he knew well, fought on battlefields made of looks and whispers. That night, Billy lay awake in his bed at the boarding house, listening to the nightly sounds of the city. The wind made the wood creak, horses stirred restlessly in the stable, and somewhere far away, a coyote lamented his loneliness to the crescent moon. He thought of Renata and the unspoken words that seemed to float between them whenever their paths crossed. Time in the West had its own cadence. It was not only measured in hours and days, but in moments of mutual understanding, in looks that spoke more than words, in shared silences that created stronger bonds than spoken promises. Billy was beginning to understand that his arrival at Redemption Springs might not be just another stop on his aimless journey. The next morning, fate created the opportunity that both seemed to be waiting for without knowing it. The opportunity came when 3 drunken men decided that Renata Silveira needed to be reminded of her place in the social hierarchy of Redemption Springs. Billy was leaving the hall when he heard altered voices coming from the direction of her house. The tone was not one of casual conversation. It was the kind of sound that made experienced men instinctively tap the handle of the gun, even before they fully understood what was happening. He quickened his pace, his boots echoing on the wooden pavement floor. The 3 men were in Renata's small garden, trampling on her flowers as they gesticulated menacingly. They were Morrison ranch workers, known for their arrogance when the drink loosened their tongues and hardened their hearts. Renata was on the porch, standing, with a posture that showed controlled fear transformed into determination. Billy stopped at the low fence that delimits the garden. He didn't say a word, just positioned himself there, with his hands relaxed at his sides, but ready for anything. His presence changed the dynamics of the situation instantly. The 3 men turned to him, their expressions changing from confident predators to animals uncertain about the territory they had gotten themselves into. The largest of the 3, a man named Jake Morrison, a cousin of the ranch owner, took a step toward Billy. The drink made him feel braver than he really was, and Billy immediately recognized the type. He had faced dozens like him over the years, men who mistook brutality for force, intimidation for courage. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but something in Billy's eyes made him reconsider. It was neither a threat nor a challenge. It was something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. It was the calm of someone who had learned to measure consequences before acting, but who would not hesitate when action became necessary. The other 2 men, sensing the change in the environment, began to discreetly move away. Jake was left alone in his bravado, and Billy saw the exact moment when the man realized he had made a miscalculation. The drink was still burning in his veins, but reality was beginning to seep through the mist of alcohol. Billy finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. He only said that those men had other places to be, and that it would be better if they went there. It was not an explicit threat, but it carried the weight of all the confrontations he had avoided and all the ones he had not been able to avoid. Jake hesitated for a moment that seemed to last forever. His fists clenched and opened, as if weighing his options. Then, without a word, he gestured to his companions, and the 3 of them walked away, their heavy boots echoing in the dusty street, until the sound was lost in the distance. Renata came down from the porch and walked to where Billy was still standing by the fence. They looked at each other for a long moment, and this time there was not the safe distance from the main street between them. She was close enough that he could see little lines around her eyes, marks of someone who had learned to smile, even when life didn't offer many reasons. She thanked him with simple words, but Billy realized that there was more behind the gratitude. There was a recognition that he had chosen to get involved when he could have easily kept walking. It was a choice that said something about the kind of man he was, and they both understood the importance of this moment. Billy offered to help fix the trampled flowers. It was not a request or a formal offer of help. It was simply the right thing to do. Renata hesitated for a moment, not out of suspicion, but because she was used to taking care of things alone. Then he nodded, and the 2 knelt in the small garden. Working on the land had something meditative about it. His hands removed the broken stems and addressed those that could still be saved. Renata explained about each type of flower, how some were more resistant than others, how the secret was to find the right balance between water and sun, protection and exposure. Billy listened and learned. It had been a long time since he had dedicated himself to creating something instead of just surviving each day. The simple work of tending to the plants awakened something in him that had lain dormant during years of aimless drift. It was as if his hands reminded him that they could do more than just defend themselves. As they worked, a natural conversation began to flow between them. They were not intimate questions or profound revelations. They were observations about the city, about the people, about small things that they had both noticed but had never shared with anyone. It was the kind of conversation that builds bridges between two solitudes. Renata talked about how she had arrived in Redemption Springs 3 years earlier, coming from a larger city where opportunities for a single woman were even more limited. She had learned sewing from her mother and decided that her skills could give her independence, even if that independence came with judgments and whispers. Billy shared fragments of his own journey, without going into detail about the reasons that had brought him there. He talked about cities he had known, about people he had met along the way, about the strange freedom that came from having no roots anywhere. But as he spoke, he realized that this freedom was beginning to look more like escape. The sun was setting when they finished repairing the garden. The saved flowers rose again, a little bruised but still alive. It was a metaphor that neither of them had to verbalize. They both understood about being hurt but continuing to grow, about finding ways to flourish even in difficult soil. When Billy got up to leave, Renata did something unexpected. He said he made coffee better than anyone in Martha's boarding house and asked him if he would like to have a cup before he left. It was a simple invitation, but they both knew it meant more than just hospitality. Billy accepted, and they climbed the porch steps together. Renata's house was small but organized, with simple furniture that she had chosen and arranged herself. There were curtains she had sewn, cushions that showed her talent for turning fabric into beauty, small details that spoke of someone who had created a real home from very little. The coffee was actually better than anything Billy had tasted in a long time. They sat at the small kitchen table as the last lights of the day faded through the window. The conversation continued, slower now, punctuated by comfortable silences that two people can share when they begin to feel safe in each other's presence. It was then that she said the words that changed everything. She talked about how the townspeople expected her to behave in a certain way, to bow her head, to apologize for her independence. She said that she was not the kind of lady they wanted her to be, and that she had stopped trying to be. Billy answered without hesitation, his words coming out with an honesty that surprised him. He said that was exactly why he was attracted to her, because she was real, because she had the courage to be herself in a world that constantly tried to mold her into something different. The moment that followed was silent but loaded with possibilities. They both knew that they had crossed an invisible line, that they had admitted something that made it impossible to go back to what they had been just a few hours before. Night fell completely over Redemption Springs, but inside Renata's small kitchen, a new light had begun to shine. The words exchanged that night changed the texture of the following days in Redemption Springs, as if the air itself had acquired a different quality. Billy began to find excuses to stop by Renata's house. Sometimes she brought wood for small repairs that she mentioned she needed to do. Other times he simply walked slower when he passed by his street, hoping to see her in the garden or on the porch. It was not persecution or insistence. It was the silent dance of two people who discovered a mutual attraction and tried to figure out what to do with it. Renata also changed her schedule subtly. She started watering the plants in the late afternoon, when she knew Billy would be returning from the salon. He started shopping at the general store at the same time he used to show up there. These were encounters that seemed casual to any outside observer, but they both knew that there was an intention behind each coincidence. The conversations between them gradually deepened. Billy discovered that Renata read books, a rarity in a city where most people considered reading a waste of time. She lent him a volume of poetry that had arrived in an order of fabrics, and he spent hours trying to understand the words she had underlined in the margins. Renata learned that Billy had been many things before arriving at Redemption Springs. He had worked on ranches, had been a stagecoach guard, had even spent time helping an itinerant doctor who taught him about medicinal herbs. He was a man who collected skills as others collected coins, always prepared for the next chapter of a life that never settled anywhere. But something was changing in this dynamic. Billy started talking about Redemption Springs as if it was more than just another temporary stop. He commented on improvements that the city needed, on opportunities he saw for those who were willing to work hard. They were casual observations, but Renata listened to them with special attention. The problem was that the city was also watching them. Redemption Springs was too small for anything to go unnoticed for long. The seemingly chance encounters, the conversations on the street, the way Billy had been involved in the incident with the men at the Morrison Ranch, all of it fueled speculation and judgment. Mrs. Peterson began to make scathing comments about women who did not know how to maintain their reputation. Reverend Collins included sermons on temptation and moral propriety in his Sunday sermons. Jake Morrison and his friends would make bad jokes in the hall whenever they were sure Billy was listening. Social pressure began to affect both in different ways. Renata, who was used to whispers, seemed to harden her determination even more. She would lift her chin higher as she walked down Main Street, greet her critics with icy politeness that made them uncomfortable, continue to live her life exactly as she wanted. Billy, on the other hand, began to question whether his presence was making things more difficult for her. He had experienced leaving when his presence became a problem. It was easier to move on than to face the complications that came from settling down somewhere. But this time, the idea of leaving hurt in a way he wasn't used to feeling. The situation came to a head on a Saturday afternoon when Billy was helping Renata fix a window that wouldn't close properly. They worked in companion silence, she holding the wood as he adjusted the hinges, when Mrs. Peterson appeared on the fence with an expression of moral indignation that seemed to have been rehearsed especially for the occasion. The older woman gave a speech about decency and reputation, about what people would say, about how a young woman should behave if she wanted to be respected in the community. She spoke as if Billy wasn't there, as if he was just an inconvenient object that could be ignored while she educated Renata on appropriate behavior. Renata listened in silence until Mrs. Peterson finished her moral preaching. Then, with a calmness that impressed even Billy, he thanked him for his concern and said that he appreciated the advice, but that he had confidence in his own choices. It was not rude or disrespectful. He was firm in the way that only people who are truly sure of themselves can be. Mrs. Peterson left visibly frustrated that she had not been able to provoke a more defensive reaction. Billy and Renata went back to work at the window, but something had changed in the air between them. Outside pressure was forcing them to confront issues that they might prefer to leave unexamined any longer. That night, Billy did something he hadn't done in years. He sat on the porch of Martha's boarding house and really thought about the future. Not just about the next few days or weeks, but about what I wanted out of life, about where I wanted to be in a few years. It was a mental exercise that I had always avoided, preferring the simplicity of living only in the present. Renata, in her own home, made similar reflections. He looked out the window Billy had fixed, seeing how it now closed perfectly, and thought about what it was like to have someone who cared enough to make small repairs to his life. It was a strange and comforting feeling at the same time. The two came to the same conclusion that night, each in his own solitude. They had found something rare and precious, something worth facing the disapproval of an entire city. But they also knew that they would have to make choices soon. The moment of definitions was approaching. Billy made his decision first. The next morning, he went to Sheriff Thompson and asked about permanent opportunities in the area. There was a vacant post of deputy delegate, and some farms needed foremen. It was the kind of work that required commitment, roots, the willingness to settle down somewhere for more than a few weeks or months. Renata noticed the change immediately when she saw him that afternoon. There was something different about his stance, a decision made that was reflected in the way he looked at her and the city around him. She didn't ask what had changed, but her eyes asked the question her lips didn't ask. Billy answered in the only way he knew how to be completely honest. He said he had spent years running away from complications, avoiding anything that might tie him to a place or a person. He said that she had changed that for the first time in a long time, he wanted to stay somewhere. He wanted to build something instead of just surviving. Her answer came in the form of a smile that lit up her entire face. It was the confirmation that they were both ready to face whatever life brought, as long as they faced it together. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time for both of them, it was a future worth building. But Redemption Springs wasn't ready to accept this change without resistance, and the forces that opposed the couple were just beginning to organize. Redemption Springs' resistance came in the form of a petition that quietly circulated around the city for an entire week before Billy and Renata learned of its existence. Mrs. Peterson had organized a group of women who considered themselves guardians of the community's morals. They drafted a document requesting that Sheriff Thompson reconsider hiring Billy as deputy, claiming that his association with a woman of questionable reputation made him unsuitable for a position of authority in the city. Sheriff Thompson showed the petition to Billy one Tuesday morning, in the office that smelled of strong coffee and dusty papers. He was a righteous man who had seen many changes in Redemption Springs over the years, and he knew how to distinguish between legitimate concern and prejudice masquerading as morality. Billy read the document silently, his jaws twitching slightly as he came to the passages that referred to Renata in ways that didn't mention her name, but made her identity clear. It was the kind of cowardly attack that hid behind respectful language, but carried venom in every word. Thompson asked if Billy wanted to reconsider his decision to settle in the city. It was not pressure or suggestion that he should leave. It was the genuine question of a man who respected another's right to make his own choices, but wanted to make sure he fully understood what he was choosing. Billy folded the petition carefully and returned it to the sheriff. He said his answer was no, he didn't want to reconsider. He said he had found something in Redemption Springs that was worth any number of petitions and whispers. Thompson smiled and held out his hand to Billy, making his hiring as deputy official. Billy went directly from the police station to Renata's house. She was in her garden, tending to the plants they had saved together a few weeks earlier. The flowers had fully recovered and bloomed more abundantly, as if the experience of almost being destroyed had made them stronger. He told about the petition and his decision to accept the position anyway. Renata listened without interrupting, her hands continuing the delicate work of weeding. When he finished, she stood up and wiped her hands on her skirt, looking straight into his eyes. She said she was proud of him for staying, but that she would understand if he changed his mind. He said that he had lived with the city's disapproval for 3 years and that he could continue. What she couldn't live with was knowing that her presence in his life was causing problems. Billy replied that he had faced far worse things than the disapproval of neighbors. He said that the only thing that really scared him was the possibility of losing what they had found together. He said he wanted to build a life with her, not despite the city's opposition, but independently of it. At that moment, Jake Morrison appeared at the garden fence. But this time he was alone, and there was no smell of alcohol on his person. His expression was serious, very different from the drunken arrogance he had shown weeks before. Jake said he had come to apologize, not just for the words and actions of that night when he had drunk too much, but for all the other times he had participated in gossip about Renata. He said that his younger sister had recently come to visit him, a young woman who was also trying to build an independent life, and that it had made him think about how he treated other women who made similar choices. The apology was accepted with the grace that characterized Renata, but Billy noticed that she did not let her guard down completely. Experience had taught both that genuine changes of heart were rare, and that it was prudent to see if actions would follow words. Over the next few weeks, others in town began to demonstrate a reluctant but real acceptance of Billy's abiding presence and his relationship with Renata. It was neither a dramatic nor a universal transformation, but it was enough to create a space where they could exist without constant hostility. Billy settled into his new role with the competence of someone who had experience solving problems and dealing with people. His calm but firm approach to maintaining order in the city gradually gained respect, even from those who initially opposed his hiring. Renata continued her work as a seamstress, but now with a sense of belonging that she had not felt since she arrived in Redemption Springs. It was not just tolerance that she received from the community, but a gradual acceptance that she was a valuable part of city life. In the fall of that year, Billy built a small addition to Renata's house. No one made direct comments about the arrangement, but no one pretended not to understand what it meant either. They had created a home together, based on mutual respect and the courage to be exactly who they were. The first winter they spent together was harsh, but the house they had created was warm and welcoming. They developed routines that combined their work with moments of quiet companionship. Billy found that he enjoyed watching Renata sew, admiring the precision of her movements. The following spring, when the flowers they had planted together sprouted again in the garden, Billy realized that he no longer thought of Redemption Springs as a temporary place. It was his home, in the same way that Renata was his companion. He had found something he didn't know he was looking for, a place where he could be himself and still be part of something bigger. The words that had marked the beginning of their relationship, about not being the kind of lady others expected, about this being the very thing that made her special, had become the foundation of a life built on mutual authenticity. They never married in church, but the whole town recognized their union. On the quiet afternoons, when the sun set over the distant mountains, and they sat together on the porch, they both knew they had found something more precious than gold. They had found a place where they could be exactly who they were and be loved for it. The West was still wild, the sun was still relentless, and Redemption Springs was still a small town with big opinions. But at the heart of it all, two people had created a space of peace and mutual acceptance that proved that true love didn't need outside approval to flourish. If you enjoyed this Wild West story, don't miss our upcoming adventures. Stories of courage, love, and redemption await you on our channel. Each narrative brings unique characters and lessons that echo through time. Sign up now and be a part of this journey through the wild heart of the American West.